All right, here we go. So this is conservation tree planting, steps to success. And so I want to make a differentiation between conservation tree planting and ornamental or landscape tree planting. So the conservation tree planting is really for things like reforestation, erosion control, wildlife habitat, windbreaks, those types of plantings. So more specific to that approach. And so we're typically using smaller planting stock than you would typically find for landscape or ornamental plantings. And let me see if I can get my screen to advance here. There we go. So one of the reasons we're planting trees is that there are places on the landscape where trees are the appropriate choice. And in fact, Indiana has a history from our early days of settlement of deforestation. Thousands, even millions of acres of forest land were cleared for a variety of agricultural and land development practices, some of which were not sustainable, including farming on ground like this. And so you can even see the old tree stumps out here on this hillside farm, very likely in southern Indiana. I grew up in Bryan County, and much of the county was farmed just like this until literally all the topsoil was at the base of the hill. And that's why we now have a lot of forest land in Bryan County. It's recovered from those unsustainable agricultural practices. But you may have a lot of reasons for wanting to plant trees. And so we look at tree planting and think about all the benefits that we derive from it. And these also represent objectives you may have for doing the plantings you're planning on doing. So we think about things like erosion control and soil building, management of water flow and storage of water in the soil. We get wildlife habitat benefits from producing forest and shrub lands. Wood products, ultimately, although it takes decades in many cases for us to produce wood products from our hardwood trees here in the state. We're thinking more and more about avenues to do carbon sequestration, and tree plantings are one of the really key elements of those practices. For many of us, the aesthetics of having trees in our areas of living and working are really important. Opportunities for recreation in forest and woodland areas, the shading and cooling we get from forests, windbreaks, and many others. And so one of the things we want to think about as we're thinking about planning for tree plantings is, what are your objectives for your planting? And you may have multiple objectives. That's not uncommon at all for folks to mix objectives in terms of perhaps wanting to favor wildlife, but also doing some erosion control, and perhaps in the future hoping to have some wood products and recreational opportunities along the way. And this photo is actually from the Civilian Conservation Corps days when they were doing tree plantings to stabilize some of these sites that historically had agricultural practices and eroded really seriously. And you may be able to see in a few locations where they're using those pines on these eroded hillsides to help stabilize that soil. So how do I plan my tree planting? Well, we want to really look at, number one, making sure you get some professional advice and assistance in the planning process for this. And so there's several folks out there that can give you help with this. You can access, in many cases, your Indiana DNR district foresters. There's a district forester assigned to every county in the state, although they all have multiple county districts that may be available to help you with planning your tree planting and get you hooked up with folks who can actually do the plantings and perhaps even cost sharing assistance. We have a wide variety of private foresters in the state who are available to do tree plantings, but they can also do tree planting planning for you as well. And in many cases, they're offering kind of a turnkey process for you to get trees in the ground. You can find those folks at this website, findindianaforester.org. The Natural Resource Conservation Service, part of the USDA, and the Soil and Water Conservation Districts in your counties may also offer some planning assistance, and in the case of the NRCS, even some cost sharing assistance for some tree plantings. And we'll talk a little bit about that. They also offer access to really good soils information, and that's something else we'll discuss and how important that is for planning your planting. Purdue several years ago did a study on private land tree planting in Indiana for conservation purposes. And we found that looking at tree plantings and landowner practices that if a landowner was utilizing a forester, they more than doubled their tree planting success. And that's particularly important when we look at the fact that 75% of these conservation tree planters are first timers. And if you mess up your garden, you've got next year to try to replant it. Our tree plantings should go for decades or centuries. And so you want to make sure you do it well and do it right the first time around. And that's typically making sure you get some good professional advice and direction in that process. And that's readily available to you here in the state. So making a plan is also a very important part of getting ready to do tree plantings. And the list I've got here are all important aspects of having a good plan to direct your activities. Now, looking at this, you're going to think, well, this looks pretty intimidating. The good news is that your forester can help you develop this. And so they're going to be working with you to determine your objectives, to see what kind of things you want to accomplish, what areas you're wanting to plant, any specific requests that you have associated with what you want to see done. And then they, based on the experience they've got for planning these plantings, are going to provide a lot of this information that you're looking at here. But each of these is an important part of getting a good planting done and making sure that planting has a good chance for success. And we're going to talk a little bit about each one of these. So in addition to our objectives, one of the most important things we do in thinking about planning for tree planting is look at our site. And so there are several things that we have to look at on our site that help dictate what tree species and shrub species are available to us, and operationally what kind of planting we need to do. And soil is one of the most important aspects of that site evaluation. So the type of soil or soils that we have on site really, to a great extent, dictates the species that we can utilize successfully in those plantings. I may have an objective to grow, let's say, black walnut for timber, but black walnut is picky about where it grows. It does not want to grow in extremely dry sites, very shallow soils, or soils with a high water table, or ponded for extended periods of the year. It's just not going to do well in those locations. So I have to adjust my objectives based on the limitations presented to me by my site. We can get great soils information from an online tool called the Web Soil Survey. And this provides an opportunity for you to get maps and also planning and planting information for your land. Go to that website. It takes a little while to learn how to navigate through that. And if you're having trouble getting the information you want, you can also get this information through your local Natural Resource Conservation Service office. This is your USDA service center. Typically, almost every county in Indiana has one. In some cases, a couple of counties will share one, but you can find it in your local listings. So we're going to combine that soils information with an evaluation of our site. And so we're looking at how much slope we've got on the site. Has there been artificial drainage installed, either subsurface or surface tiles or ditches? Are there utilities that we're going to have to watch out for, utility right-of-ways? You may be able to do some plantings in some types of right-of-ways, but you need to check with the utility and see what's allowed, because ultimately they control what vegetation is growing there. And you don't want to make a planting and then them come in and essentially kill it or cut it, because they do have the right to do that in those right-of-ways. So before you do any plantings in right-of-ways, you need to check with those utilities owners to make sure that that kind of planting is allowed. Even if it's not a right-of-way, if there's old surface drainage or tiling, you need to make sure that you're not going to create problems clogging that if it's draining neighbors' properties or other issues like that. So all things that really need to be checked into before we start getting into the plantings. I mentioned old roads. A lot of times we can have some real soil compaction and even soil pH issues on old road beds. And also special sites, cemeteries, archaeological sites may impose some limitations in terms of what you can do as far as tree planting in some of those locations. As I mentioned, species selection is determined by a variety of things in terms of our planning. So the soils and the sites that we're working with in our area, what our objectives are for planting will dictate to some extent what species are going to best meet our objectives. Our regional climate, and so what species are adapted to grow in our area over the long term. And then the availability of the species from nurseries that we have access to purchase. So these site conditions can really limit our selections based on the ability of those plants to survive on those sites. I gave you the example of black walnut. The other thing I would think about is things like in northern Indiana, we can actually find things like yellow birch and paper birch growing native. But if we bring those down into southern parts of the state, where we get a little hotter summers, sometimes a little drier conditions, they will really suffer and have a lot of insect problems. There's a variety of species that we can plant in some parts of Indiana, but aren't going to do as well in others. And this is where your forester can help you with some of that species and site selection work. We do recommend strongly that you utilize native species as much as you possibly can for your plantings. The advantage of that is that our native wildlife are adapted to those species and they're used to utilizing them. They're the foundation of the habitats they live in and the needs that they have. When we bring in species that are not native to the area, we always risk introducing something that could be weedy or invasive in that area. We've certainly had issues with that. And we've been guilty of doing that in the past as foresters. So we're encouraging you to think very strongly about utilizing primarily natives as much as you can. Or if you're not going to utilize some natives, make sure there's species that don't become invasive. And once again, your forester can help you with those recommendations. So here's a kind of general list of species that are pretty good on different types of sites. And this is more of a gradient than hard lists. But in general, when we've got wet soils, we've got a group of oaks and other species that are better adapted to growing in those sites than some others. These can be pretty specialized sites. So things like swamp white oak, bur oak, and pin oak are quite good on wet or even saturated soils. Things like river birch, silver maple, shellbark hickory, bald cypress, a deciduous conifer, and some shrubs, elderberry, red osier dogwood, and buttonbush, all will tolerate water or flooding events pretty well. When we get on well-drained soils, these are really some of our best growing sites. And so the list of species actually is quite broad. We can take almost everything from the wet soil site and also grow it on the well-drained soils. But this list really represents those tree species and shrub species we would typically find on those sites, plus many more. So some that you might commonly plant here in Indiana, the red and white oak groups, black cherry, black walnut, several species of hickory, but bitternut hickory tends to do particularly well on these high quality sites. Tulip tree, well known for that. White pine, and then redbud is a smaller tree, and wildlife shrubs, hazelnut and American plum. But as I mentioned, species from both of these sides, wet and dry, can typically do just fine on these well-drained soils. When we get to dry sites, once again, we're getting into more of a special environment that introduces some stresses that our plants need to be able to tolerate. And so some of the oaks that are pretty good on dry soils are chestnut oak, white oak, scarlet oak, to a lesser extent, black oak, shagbark hickory and mockernut hickory, pretty good on dry areas. And then a species that's really good for wildlife, persimmon. And we can actually plant persimmon across the state, even though it's native primarily to the southern half. Red cedar, an excellent tough conifer, just needs a lot of sunlight, won't tolerate any shade. And then flowering dogwood and serviceberry, but several other shrubs also that we can manage well on dry soils. And that's an incomplete list. You can get a more complete list through several different resources I've got here. Number one, always consult with your forester about recommendations for species for your particular site. But another good reference is a Purdue Extension publication, Planting Forest Trees and Shrubs in Indiana. That's FNR-IDNR 36 is the publication number, but you can web search either of those or go to our Purdue sites and you'll be able to find that publication available online. We have an online publication from the Forest Service that gives really good detailed information about individual tree species. And it's called Silvix of North America. And there's a hardwood and a conifer edition. And so you can take a look at both of those to get a feel for different species that might work well for our area. And then many tree and shrub ID books also talk about the sites and characteristics of the places where these things grow. And so that can be a good guide for matching up species to your site. And then many tree nurseries, including Vilonia Nursery or the Indiana State Tree Nurseries, provide descriptions of the trees and the sites they do best on in their nursery materials. So those are all good references for making some decisions about what group of tree species might work best for your plantings based on your site and your objectives. One of the things James and I were talking about earlier is the lack of seedling currently available at the state nurseries. So we encourage people, if you're planning on planting trees, to get your list of tree species together and order early. And early here is typically the fall before the spring you plan to plant. So if you were waiting until this spring to get your seedlings, unfortunately, if you're ordering from the state nursery, the availability of species is going to be pretty limited. Where if you were ordering this fall, you had a much better chance to get the list of species that you're really looking to get. So ordering those seedlings early will get you a head start into the planting process, reserve those seedlings for delivery or pick up the next spring, and you've got what you want. You do have several options in terms of locations you can get your trees. We have a wonderful Indiana DNR state tree nursery system that sells a little over 2 million trees a year, I think, at this point, of many different species, trees and shrubs, at minimal cost to citizens of Indiana. And so if you have land here in Indiana, you have access to this tree nursery for conservation tree planting, tree purchases. They do start accepting their orders in the fall, and typically will start the actual order filling process sometime in early to mid-October. So good idea to get your orders in before then. I typically see the order forms available about state fair time is when a lot of times they'll have them available for folks to start getting either online or at local offices. It's a wonderful system, high quality seedlings. I think the typical seedling price is around $35 or so per 100. You're ordering usually 1 or 2 year old bare root seedlings, and we'll show you some examples of that. So it's conservation style tree planting stock, but a great deal. We also have some very good private nurseries here in Indiana that offer conservation tree planting stock, and they may offer some species and sizes that aren't readily available from the state nursery. And so we have a site down here at the bottom, www.rngr.net. And this site is run by the U.S. Forest Service and some other partners. And you can actually search for tree nurseries and other sources of tree information for your state at that site, and then give you a list of the tree nurseries that are available. So a great reference to find sources of planted seedlings. Also now I'm finding more and more of the local county soil and water conservation districts are having tree and shrub and native plant sales. And these may be happening both spring and fall. But check in with your local soil and water conservation district, oftentimes the same office building as the Natural Resource Conservation Service. And they can let you know about their tree sales program in the county if they have one, or neighboring counties that may offer those. And that's another nice resource for a variety of plant material. So I mentioned the type of seedlings that you might be interested in getting. So there's several avenues that you've got. Probably the most commonly planted conservation tree seedlings are what we call bare root seedlings. And these are seedlings grown from seed at a nursery. State nurseries is a good example. This is what they produce. And it's just as the name says, when they're lifted from the seed beds, they are packed as a bare root seedling, usually in a moist medium, wrapped up in bags or paper, and delivered to you or picked up by you, typically in the spring for planting. And so this is an example of a bare root conifer seedling. This is actually Bob Hawkins, the manager of Lonia Nursery, DNR Nursery, Southern Indiana, and he's got a couple of 2-year-old pecan seedlings. And so you can see completely different root system between the conifers and the hardwoods. A lot of our hardwoods have this big taproot. Makes for a really hardy, excellent quality seedling. And that's really what the state nurseries are known for. You've also got, particularly from some private nurseries, the option of buying containerized seedlings. And these come in a variety of sizes and types of containers. So many of the conifers are grown in these what's called styro blocks. And so it's a small one-season seedling, oftentimes in a medium that's not even soil. It might be a variety of different growth medium. But the nice advantage of these is they're very easy to transport, and you've got an intact root system as you plant it. It's not a huge seedling, but it can still be a nice, vigorous seedling with high-quality results if it's planted correctly and cared for. And these are available from several private nurseries in a variety of locations, including here in Indiana in the case of some of the hardwoods. And here's an example of some hardwood containerized seedlings. This is actually the research group that I work with at Purdue University. We use some containerized seedlings for our plantings, but there are some companies here in Indiana and across the Midwest that sell containerized hardwoods of a variety of sizes, anything from perhaps a foot or 2 foot tall seedling to some that are 3 to 5. In some cases, for some conservation practices, we can even use cuttings. So for the willows and the true poplars, things like aspens and cottonwoods, we can actually take a stick from the most recent year's growth that's anywhere from 15 to 18 inches long, cut a section out of that, and stick about half of it in good moist soil. And in many cases, that will root. And in fact, this is a practice they use for stabilizing stream banks and other locations with willow and poplar sticks. And it's a way that we often propagate some of these species in nurseries. And so if you buy willows or poplars, in some cases, you may actually be getting a cutting as opposed to a seedling grown from seed. But you can, in some cases, plant seeds as well. And of course, the nurseries are doing that, but some people decide to do what they call direct seeding. And this is where they're actually seeding seed into the areas they want to grow trees. Now, this can have some advantages and disadvantages. Seed may be, in some cases, if you've got access to it, easier to get a hold of and easier to handle than seedlings. But you've got to recognize that there are a lot of seed predators out there, like squirrels and other rodents, that are happy to eat that seed and or move it around. So it's probably a little less reliable as seedlings, but you may be able to get a few more trees per acre planted if you're utilizing seed. The other thing we want to think about when we're thinking about our planting design, in addition to the seedling type, is what is our spacing going to be? And this is dictated oftentimes by what our objectives are for the planting and what we hope to see in the future as far as a future condition for that planting. And so for high quality reforestation or timber production, we typically are looking at a little bit tighter spacings than we might for wildlife habitat or windbreaks. So what we're really looking to do is create a forest environment as quickly as we can in these planting sites. And to do that, we're oftentimes planting at densities of 8 feet by 8 feet or less. And so that's 8 feet between the rows and 8 feet within the planting rows. This is about 680 trees planted per acre. But we can even tighten that up to get a quicker canopy cover and more of a forest environment faster on that site. And so those high density plantings provide an opportunity to shade the site quicker, to hopefully overwhelm things like deer and rodents, and also to produce that shady environment that is natural on the forest floor. So we've been moving more and more toward higher density plantings as time has gone on, because some of the studies we're doing are indicating that they have a tendency to be a little more successful than some of the wider spacings. Now, if you're kind of working between some of these goals or leaning more toward the wildlife side, nothing wrong with a little wider spacing. And so the 10 by 8s and 10 by 10s have been done for many years. We can still get decent timber quality out of those and also good wildlife habitat. For windbreaks, we may even be a little further apart because we want more time with the full crown and canopy of some of those conifers for windbreaks, so their spacings may even be wider. Once again, work with your forester, let them know your objectives, what you hope to accomplish, and they can help you with recommendations on what the appropriate spacing is for your site and your desires. So this is an example of 8 foot by 8 foot spacing in a black walnut planting. It was actually put in a woodland opening. And the advantage of this is that it produces very clean, tall stems because of all the competition between trees. And that is a real advantage for timber production. We're producing straight stems, we're keeping side limbs small, so we've got minimal knots. And then we can come in usually about 12 to 15 years after planting and start thinning to provide some more growing space for those crowns of the trees we want to keep. And this is kind of an extreme example. This is a 3 by 3 foot planting of oak with some walnut. And it really came about from an example we saw in Europe and the fact that the landowner ordered more trees than they had time to clear a space to plant. And he decided to plant at really high density. And this planting has done incredibly well and produced some beautiful stems of oak and walnut in the process, and really kind of overwhelmed the deer in terms of their ability to do much damage to this planting area. The other thing we want to think about is the growth rate of the trees we plant with each other, adjacent to each other. And so I think about this in terms of trying to avoid really hard decisions down the road. So one of the things I've seen is, and I really am in favor of this, is what we call mixed species plantings, where we're planting several different species in a mixture across the planting site, as opposed to just 1 or 2 species. And I think this is a really good practice and reflects what we would see in most forest environments as well, and provides a lot of benefits, including wildlife habitat, but also kind of a hedge against mistakes we may have made in terms of evaluating our site for certain species. And we don't know what the timber markets are going to be down the road if you're thinking about what species you want to grow for timber. So having a diversity is a really good thing. But what we see sometimes is if we don't arrange that diversity well, we end up with some species completely outgrowing others. And then we've got difficult choices to make in terms of what we're going to take in thinning versus what we're going to keep. And so I'd encourage you to work with your forester to think about the quality of your site and the species you plan to grow, and cluster species of similar growth rates together. And so on high quality sites, tulip tree, cherry, and walnut will almost always outgrow most of the oaks that we would plant, and certainly the hickories. So if we plant those right adjacent to each other, what we're typically going to have is a bunch of cherry, tulip tree, and even walnut completely growing past the oaks. And if we want to actually save some oaks in that planting, we've got a difficult decision then to make. Am I going to cut down, thin out larger trees to save these smaller trees? Where if I had planted patches or groups of these faster growing trees and then groups of these slower growing trees together, I would have the opportunity to maintain some of that diversity across the site and not have some of those more difficult decisions. We're still going to have to thin, but you may be able to retain more of your species diversity off the site by thinking about those variable growth rates as we think about planting. The other thing I would encourage you to think about and consider for your planting planning is the possibility of using windbreaks around the outside edge of your planting, particularly if this is an open ground. And also what we call nurse or trainer trees between the rows of trees you really want to keep on the planting site. And so I see advantages in both these. Number one, for protection of your ultimate trees you want to keep on site, and then also shading down weed competition. And a really nice nurse tree on many locations, as long as it's not excessively wet, is white pine. White pine is native to just a few areas in Indiana, but grows across the state in many locations pretty well. And it makes a really good companion planting tree in rows with many of our hardwoods. And then with time, we can start thinning out the white pine to favor some of those hardwoods. In the meantime, the white pine, through that evergreen shade and drop of needles, is actually shading down weeds and even mulching that forest floor and forcing those hardwoods to grow straight and tall, and producing really high quality timber trees in the process. And so this is a row of oaks planted in between rows of white pine. We're really getting some nice quality out of those trees. The windbreak effect on the outside edge of the planting can also be important. A study was done in Ohio State several years ago, looking at the impact of putting a windbreak next to rows of walnut versus no windbreaks. And they saw growth advantages to the walnut that it had a conifer windbreak in front of them for up to 7 years after the windbreak was even removed. So there can be some real benefits to you of having windbreaks around your planting, particularly in open ground, both for protection from wind stress, but also perhaps even knocking down some of the herbicides that we'll get from neighboring fields in some cases. One of the other issues we want to look at in designing our planting and thinking about our species is designing plantings for wildlife habitat. And for many folks, this is a primary objective. And the elements that we're typically thinking about in wildlife habitat are food value for the species of interest, cover or places to escape or rest, water, and then just general space for the species not to have conflicting interactions with other species or species of its own. And with our plantings, we can typically provide through our planning both the food and the cover with our selection of appropriate species. And so you want to think about what food values do my wildlife species of interest need through the growing season that I can provide through the plants that I put on site. And then what kind of cover? So do they prefer more open forest, or are they looking for some brushy ground? Or do they even need a little bit of prairie in adjacency to some brush and trees? And so we can actually plan for all those things in a tree planting if we want to think about what wildlife species we want to manage for and what habitat needs they've got. So it's an excellent way to favor a variety of wildlife on your property, draw wildlife to your property, and have a really enjoyable planting that meets your objectives through time. And we're oftentimes doing that with diversity. And so we're looking at species that provide kind of the candy. And so that would be things like the center here, pawpaw. It's a short season fruit. It gets eaten quickly and then it's gone, but it's really attractive to a lot of species. Some of the meat and potatoes are kind of on the outside edges. So things like the hawthorns and crab apples and the oaks can be core food species for many species. Oaks, if you ask a wildlife biologist in many cases, what's the most important plant species or tree species for wildlife in Indiana, it would be the oak group. And then a really good survival food for many wildlife are things that don't get eaten immediately, but are still hanging on the trees this time of year. And that's things like crab apples, hawthorns, and some of the others. And we've got a really good publication through Purdue Extension, designing hardwood tree plantings for wildlife, that you can refer to. They'll give you some good ideas. And then you can definitely talk to your forester and other natural resource professionals about recommendations for designing your plantings to be friendly to wildlife habitat. So once we've got actually our objectives put together, we've selected our species, we need to start thinking about how do we get this area ready for planting? And that oftentimes is starting well ahead of our planting date, in many cases the season before. So one of the things we've talked to you about already is looking at the soils on your site and get a feel for what type of soils you've got. That's going to dictate what species you plant where. The Web Soil Survey will produce maps just like we see here with those outlines showing the different soil types, and then a variety of tables with really good information on all different characteristics of the soil and even recommendations for species to plant. The other thing I recommend people do is do a soil test. And we've not done that as much as maybe we should in the past, particularly on agricultural land. It's always a good idea if we've got nutrient deficiencies or issues with pH to try to fix those as best we can prior to planting. It's a lot easier to put those materials on a bare field than it is after the planting is in place. Now, I will say on pH, in many cases, it's difficult to change soil pH a lot over a long period of time. If the pH has been changed due to bad agricultural practices, we may be able to do some work with that. But if it's kind of the native soil pH, that can be a difficult thing to deal with. And so you may have to work with what you've got in that one. But if we've got nutrient deficiencies that are due to past management practices, we can do some corrections on those. And many times those are pretty long lasting for trees because we're not taking crops off those areas. So those nutrients can cycle on site. The other thing we want to look at is what kind of weed competition is present on the site that we're planning on planting. And so if I see this, I've got some work to do. This is goldenrod and grasses that are perennials. And these are very strong competitors with a lot of our tree seedlings. And so this is something I want to eliminate prior to planting. Typically the growing season before, I'm going to be using herbicides and or tillage to get rid of as much of this as I can. And really herbicides are oftentimes an important part of this picture. Even tillage is not going to necessarily completely eliminate some of this material. So important that we address weed issues. One of the easiest places to plant is a field that's been in crops the season before. Although if you do have these kind of issues, we can get started the season before and get these taken care of and have a good planting area prepared for the next season. If you have brush, invasive species, or other things that are going to be problematic on your site, once again, you want to control those before you do your tree planting. It's the easiest time to address those issues. If we have really significant soil compaction problems on our site, we have found some advantages in doing what we call soil ripping. And so this is a bar or a hook, pardon me, that is pulled through the soil. Usually it's a couple of feet long and busts up a compaction layer, allowing root systems to get through that. And so some sites that have had a lot of agricultural traffic or other traffic on them will have a hard pan, and we can break up those hard pans and allow for better rooting. Now, last year's program, we talked about this some, and we had a consulting forester, Mike Denman, actually comment that he didn't want the site busted up too loose, though, because the planting machine wouldn't always be able to pack the root systems back down in if it was too light and broken up. And so this is just enough to break that barrier, but we're not just pulverizing the site. We actually want fairly firm soil for a good tree planting job if we're using mechanical equipment. So that was a really good suggestion and an important point. And so once again, work with your forester and your tree planting contractors to evaluate your site. But this is not a bad practice to consider if you've had a long history of agriculture or grazing, and we may have some soil compaction on site. Best done typically the fall before planting. In spring, we can have pretty wet soil conditions, and trying to do this in spring could make either no difference or even make the situation worse. Cover crops are not a bad idea if we're thinking about planting. And there's several options you've got available to you. This is a planting we actually did on one of our properties for Purdue in tree planting, and it had a winter wheat cover crop on it. This is a spring planting. So we were actually mowing off the winter wheat to get a little better access to the site, but you wouldn't necessarily even have to do that. So you've got options like winter wheat, which actually can provide even a little bit of what we call allelopathy. That's chemical warfare against weeds germinating in the area. And then it dies about mid-season. We would still probably provide a weed control band where we put our trees, but the areas in between could have that cover crop on there and prevent weed growth to some extent through that cover crop. We can also look at perennial cover crops, things like some of the clovers or perennial ryegrasses, things like that. We're typically trying to avoid having heavy heavy rooted perennial grasses, though, as a major part of the planting. These are very bad competitors with trees. And so annual plants or light rooted plants, some things like some of the small clovers, decent cover crops. If we've got something really heavy like alfalfa, brome, fescue, we want to avoid those because they can become very competitive. So all this operation is easier to do before we do the planting. So those are things we want to do. If you do need to control some vegetation on your site, there's a variety of approaches you can take. Herbicide applications can be quite effective done the season before. One of the materials we use extensively is glyphosate. It'll kill most plants that are green and growing. Done as a foliar spray. You can see this truck rig here that's going across a potential planting site. We've already got the rows flagged out. I will tell you that sometimes having agricultural equipment on some of these planting sites doesn't work out as well as we'd like. If you look on the right side boom, it's way up in the air. The spray is kind of fanning out. On the left side, it's gotten a little close to the ground and we're not getting complete coverage. So you've got to watch those applications sometimes to make sure you get a good spray pattern on those areas. But to get that vegetation killed beforehand, highly recommended. If the vegetation is really tall and rank, mow it about mid-season and let it grow back for 2 or 3 weeks. Then you can come back in and on that smaller amount of vegetation, get a good coverage of glyphosate. We typically have used 1 to 2 quarts per acre, and you want to do that prior to frost when the plants are still actively growing. In some cases, you may have a window to do this type of activity in the spring, but we really recommend you do it the season before because those spring windows can be pretty narrow and may get in the way of some of your desires to get started with tree planting itself. If you're looking at an organic operation, you've got a little more work ahead of you. You can control some of this stuff with tillage and perhaps even mulching, but it's going to be a little bit more effort for sure. So once we've got our site ready, we can start thinking about our planting. And typically with our bare root seedlings, we're planting in the spring. And so the nurseries provide, in many cases, options of either having seedlings shipped to you via one of the freight carriers or pick up at the nurseries. And if you're working with a forester or tree planting contractor, you can work with them to have your seedlings picked up by the planters so that they get them when they're ready to do the planting. Otherwise, you can work with the nurseries to decide what technique you want to have, whether it's shipment to your place or pick up at the nursery when you're ready to start your planting. In either case, if you're handling these seedlings, you need to think about some characteristics of the storage that you need to take into consideration to keep these seedlings in good shape. So when these are lifted out of the seedling beds, they're typically stored in coolers a little bit above freezing and high humidity. And this is to keep the trees themselves dormant so they're not having any water demand on the root systems and to keep the root systems moist. So these are tree bags with sphagnum moss in them. A lot of moisture in there, high humid environment, keeps the root seedlings really nice and moist, provides any little bit of moisture that these seedlings need to maintain themselves. We do not want to see dry root systems because oftentimes a dry root is a dead root. But we also don't want to completely saturate these seedlings. So like storing them in a bucket of water for 3 or 4 days is also not desirable because they still need oxygen to also do well. So this type of packing material is ideal. That temperature is what they need. If you can't keep it in that range, you'll want to get those seedlings planted as quickly as you possibly can. Outside that range, the seedlings can start becoming active. They can start having water demand out of root systems and we can dry roots out. So important that you do good planning and careful handling of those seedlings. You also don't want to store them for any amount of time in the wind or sun. That warming and that drying of the wind can have a pretty negative impact on them. So having some tarps and coverings or places that are shady to store while you're planting can also be beneficial. If you can't get your seedlings planted as quickly as you'd like, you do have one option in addition to trying to keep them in good shape in the bags or the storage medium. And that is what we call heeling in. This is where we dig a trench, preferably in a protected area, nice to have some shade, not a lot of wind. And we're going to lay the seedling bundles in that trench and bury the root systems with soil and or mulch. And then water it down real good to keep them moist. Now, this is temporary. You're still under the influence of temperatures, and they're still going to have moisture demand. And so once those trees start getting active, they need to go in the ground as quickly as possible. If we're starting to see buds breaking, you need to move quickly to make sure those seedlings get planted so that they'll have an opportunity to get rooted well and perform well once that planting is started. Now, this looks serious, and it's not as bad as it looks. So in many cases, the nurseries have done a really good job of producing a big, healthy, hardy root system on your tree. And that's great if you can get that all in the ground with the planting equipment you've got. And I encourage you to take pains to get as much of that root system in the ground as you can. But if that root system is too long and sprangly to get in the hole effectively, you can trim root ends off. And so you can use a machete or a cleaver or any number of other tools to hack off the outside edges of the root system or shorten up tap roots in the case of some of the hardwoods. But I don't like to see a taproot cut any less than about 10 to 12 inches long. We're starting to sacrifice some of the growth potential of that tree when we're removing some of that root. So just trim it to the extent that it takes to be able to plant it effectively. And so how do we plant? Well, we're typically, as I mentioned, with a bare rootstock, planting ideally March to April. If we've got thawed ground, a good break in the weather, good soil moisture, this is the ideal time because then our soils are going to start warming up. We're going to have good water available in the spring. And it's a great time for those root systems to start established for these small seedlings. We want to make sure we keep our seedlings cool and moist, as we mentioned, until they're planted. And then we need to make sure we get them planted at the correct depth. And we were trying to get them planted as close to where they were growing at the nursery depth as we can. And that is actually indicated by a little bit of a change in color and also a change in texture between the stem and the root. And we can see this red pin pointing to what we call the root collar. And that is the area where we transition from the stem of the tree to the root system. And then you can see that little change of color just above that point. That is where that tree was ground line at the nursery. And we'd like to get it planted as close to that zone as we can, again, that ground line color change. We don't want root system exposed above the soil surface because that will dry and can compromise seedling health. So we're really aiming to get that root collar, that shift between the stem and the root, about 1/2 inch or inch below the ground. If we plant it too deep, we can kind of starve the roots for oxygen. If we plant it too shallow, we can actually dry out the root system. And then make sure we seal the hole or the planting slit effectively so that there's no air pockets in there to also dry out that seedling root system. If you're going to hand plant, and that's certainly one approach to planting you can do for small scale planting, there's a variety of tools you can utilize. A good quality shovel will work fine. It's a little more work with a shovel than some of the purpose-built planting tools. So on the left-hand side here, I've got 3 different examples of a purpose-built planting tool. On the far left, what looks like this super duper hoe is actually called a Hodad or Hodag. And it is thrown into the ground, literally, straight down in, and then you kind of pull it back to create a planting slit, and then pull it back out to tamp in the soil in that location. These are really good for fine textured soils, particularly sandy sites or even rocky sites. I don't see them used as much here in Indiana. We've got a little heavier soils. And so oftentimes what I see being used is the heavy duty tree planting bar, also called the KBC bar by some. This can be both ordered from a variety of forestry supply companies. Also, I see some that are custom built. So we've got an ordered one here in the center, and this one looks like it's a custom built job over here on the right. You also will need containers to put moist medium and with a little bit of water in to keep your root systems moist while you plant. 5-gallon buckets with some sphagnum moss, peat moss, or even ground up newspaper or cardboard can work. Or sometimes you can even get rubberized planting bags like this gentleman has here. He's on a tree planting crew, probably carrying 100 or so seedlings anyway with him across that field in those rubberized bags to keep those root systems moist until they can pop that seedling in the ground. For hand planting technique, if we're using a tree planting bar, it's actually a pretty quick technique for planting trees. And so say we're utilizing the tree planting bar here, the KBC bar, we would push that bar as deep as we could get it into the ground at an angle and then push forward to create a flat face. We're then going to move our tree seedling down into that slit, trying to get the root system down as far as we can to the right planting level with that root collar about an inch or so below soil surface. We want the spreading roots to be in a nice natural pattern, not curling up and sticking back up out of the hole. So you may have to push those down in there a little bit, make sure they're spread out well. In some cases, we can do 2 holes side by side with that tree planting bar if we've got a particularly big root system. Once you get that seedling in spot there at the right depth, we can then take our tree planting bar and about 3 to 4 inches in back of our original hole, we plunge it straight down in as deep as we can get it and push forward to close the hole. You want to make sure you get it pushed forward and firmed up really well so there's no air pockets in there. And then we're going to go back again and repeat that a couple of times to gradually fill in the spot in back of that tree. And then we can finally kick in some dirt and heal that hole where we started our planting process. We want to make sure our tree is sitting nice and straight and tall in the process, not leaning over. And then we're going to take the toe of our boot and firm around the seedling. And finally, you're going to give it a little tug just to make sure it's set firm in the soil, so it's not going to wedge out. Now, if you get a large open area to plant, this is really the way to do it. There's purpose-built mechanical machines, tractor pulled, that can plant literally thousands of seedlings per day. And you'll see this large coulter or disc on the front that cuts a slit, also can roll you over rocks or logs so you don't get hung up. There's a shoe at the base that creates a planting slit, and then plates that widen that planting slit and allow you to drop trees down in there and place them. And you can see the 2 angled packing wheels on the back of the tree planter that push the soil back in around the seedling. And a high quality crew of 3 or 4 folks can plant a few thousand trees a day in good open ag land. And so this is a very effective, efficient piece of equipment that can produce a lot of planting in a short period of time on open ground. And many of our consulting foresters and tree planting contractors here in Indiana have this equipment available. And there are a few saltwater conservation districts and other organizations in the state that may be able to rent or loan this material equipment to you too, if you're used to using equipment and have tractors available. So that's something you could explore locally. Typically, we're planting bare root seedlings with this approach, but very effective, very efficient. All right, let's take a break now. That's the planting process. And we hope to get that done by typically no later than about middle May in most parts of the state. We'd really like to get it done by March or April. But that's the process we go through for most of our bare root planting. We have a longer season for containerized planting because it has an established root system. But for many folks using the bare root approach, that's how we do it. So I'm going to stop sharing at this point, and we can take a little bit of break and also take care of some of the questions that we may have. So James, I've been watching the numbers and I see there's a bunch of questions that have popped up. So we'll go ahead and tackle those.
All right, our first one is just kind of a general question about food forests and planting those. I don't have a lot of information on that or experience, so I figured I'd pass that one on to you.
Okay, I'm assuming this maybe is people food. So you do have a variety of options. We've got lots of different nut and fruit producing trees that could be utilized for people food production. But I would just say that to get maximum production off those trees, they need to be pretty widely spaced. So trees that are in a lot of competition with each other tend to have more compact crowns, and so they're not going to produce as much fruit as something that would be outgrowing by itself. So that's one consideration to think about. Pardon me, if you're thinking about growing some trees for actual production of the food value.
Okay, we've got another question about spraying weeds in the fall or the spring. How long should you wait to plant after applying herbicide? And can you carefully spray around trees once they're planted, white pines in particular?
Yeah, great question. So our fall applications are going to be happening well before we do planting in the spring. And so we don't have any worries typically with the typical materials we utilize. And I'm going to give you some of those materials. You always want to refer to the label on the herbicide. It's going to give you essentially a replanting or re-entry timeline. And you want to follow those recommendations to make sure that you don't have any impacts. If you're following those recommendations, you're typically going to be good if you've appropriately applied those herbicides. And yes, depending on your application approach and the materials in terms of herbicides you're using, you can spray around trees. But I qualify that it's how you approach your application and the materials you're using. We have herbicides that are essentially a contact herbicide, so they're being sprayed on living vegetation. If you can direct that such that it does not touch the living vegetation on your trees with something like glyphosate, you can do what we call a directed spray. You're hitting the weeds, but not hitting the tree. That can be very effective. We have some soil active herbicides that you need to make sure you can control the rate of application, because it's essentially killing things based on their size, their species, and where they are in their growth process. So where a seedling could be resistant to it, a herbaceous weed or grass may not be, but it's still going to be in the soil. So the rate of application becomes very important on those. And we'll get into that a little bit. And that's also an area where if you're not experienced with that and some of the materials, that's a good idea to work with a professional.
All right, we've got another question about planting and using augers.
Augers are a possibility, and we have used augers for planting containerized stock with the group I work with at Purdue. I will warn you that you want to be careful with augers because they can produce what we call the bathtub effect. And so if you're augering into really heavy wet soils or soils that are seasonally wet, we can actually kind of polish the edges of that hole, and it's hard for water to drain out of those. The other thing is you're going to find that you need all the soil you kicked out of the auger hole back in to get it planted at the same level. So it can work, but it has some special considerations. So one of the things I'd recommend is if you're seeing the kind of that polishing of the outside edge of the auger hole, take a shovel and scour the sides to make sure there's breaks there so the root systems can get through, and then make sure you get enough soil back in to appropriately plant your seedlings in there. So the first 3 to 5 years, we are looking at doing weed control at least for the first 2 or 3 years. And I like to see 3 years of follow-up weed control in many cases on tree plantings. We also need to consider what practices we may need to limit animal damage to the seedlings we planted. And particularly we're thinking about deer, but we may have issues with rodents and rabbits as well. Now, I showed this photo of this planting to ask if you think that is effective weed control. And I will tell you the appropriate answer is no. Mowing in general does not help us a lot when it comes to real weed control for tree plantings. It may make us feel better about the planting, but it actually can be counterproductive in some respects. So mowing has a tendency to favor grass. And grass is one of our most serious competitors with our tree seedlings. And so one of the last things I want to see becoming common and favored in tree plantings are heavy-rooted perennial grasses. So actually limited amounts of mowing or no mowing are really the direction we try to go in many cases if we can. The other problem with mowing is you can't get really close to seedlings, and so we've still got this root growth right around, or this weed growth right around the root system of the seedling, competing with it for nutrients, light, and water. And so that's problematic as well. So we're going to talk about some effective techniques of controlling weeds and also hopefully dealing with any critter problems you may have. And then down the road, depending on your objectives for the property and your planting, there may be some things you want to do in terms of management that include things like thinning the plantation and pruning in the plantation. So effective weed control is enough weed control to provide our seedlings a head start on that planting site that will get them a competitive advantage over other vegetation that would like to dominate them and take the site over. And so this is a planting that I would consider effective weed control. This is a 1-year-old oak planting that we actually did as an experiment at Purdue for genetic purposes, tree breeding. But we got really good weed control on this. And so this was an ag field type condition. So you can see the weeds coming back in are primarily annuals. And I'll be honest, I don't get too worried about annual weed competition unless it's really tall and dense, like some of the ragweeds, or it's really heavy cover, like some of the foxtail grass can be. But if I see this early to mid-season, that's really highly desirable. So I'm getting all of the nutrients and water in the locations around those seedlings available to them to grow. And I'm also not getting any shading on those seedlings, so they're getting the full advantage of that sunlight. And we'd like to see that kind of weed control effectiveness happening up into like mid growing season, up into July. As those herbicides start to fade a little bit in their effectiveness, we'll start seeing some weeds come in, but in many cases, the seedlings have done the majority of their growing and storing carbohydrates by that mid-season point. And so it becomes less of an issue. This is a really good practice to do for 2 to 3 seasons after the season of planting. And we should have good control during the season of planting as well. And oftentimes the tree planters are applying herbicides at or shortly after the time of planting to get that weed control. The other advantage of this type of weed control is that it produces a more open area that's not friendly to things like rabbits and rodents that will chew on the bark and bases of our seedlings, sometimes chewing them off. Now, our hardwoods will oftentimes sprout back from that damage. Conifers oftentimes not so much. So those open territories like this, where there's a lot of overhead visibility, not friendly to rodents and rabbits. They don't like having very little cover because they're very available to predators in those locations. The disadvantage of this is it does make these very available to deer. And so there are some cases where we will actually tolerate annual weeds like you see between the rows here in order to shield the seedlings from browse from deer. And so once again, this is an area to talk with your forester in terms of their recommendations on weed management on your site to balance the benefits versus the costs of having really good weed control versus potentially very heavy deer depredation. And we'll talk a little bit about how to deal with deer here in just a few moments. What I don't like to see is this, and that is heavy grasses and perennial weeds around our trees. These perennial plants have large established root systems that are heavily competing with the root systems of our planted seedlings that are just trying to get established and get access to moisture and nutrients in the soil. Some of these can even do that chemical warfare we talked about earlier called allelopathy. They're actually exuding chemicals that act against other plants trying to get established on site. And so it's kind of a double whammy against our planted seedlings. So ideally, you want to have this type of vegetation controlled before you do your planting and work against it as a part of plantation management. So some techniques we use, and I am going to talk a lot about herbicides because it tends to be the most economical, efficient, and in many cases, most effective approach at weed control for establishing tree plantations. So our herbicide selection depends on several things: the species of trees and shrubs we utilize, the soil and site conditions on our site, what kind of weed competition we anticipate dealing with or already have to deal with, and then what herbicides are labeled for the uses we want to use them for. We cannot use herbicides that are not labeled for the types of applications we're putting them on. And then what kind of equipment and experience the applicator of those herbicides has. So an example is, I've got a list here of pre-emergent herbicides. These are herbicides we'd actually put on the site in the late winter, early spring to control weeds as they germinate and start growing. And so they're soil active in many cases, or a combination of contact on the plants that are already growing and then soil activity as well. And so several common ones are simazine, pendulum, surfland, and oust. These all are very important to control the rate of application per acre. And so we have to know how much spray and what percentage of herbicide we're applying per unit area to make sure that we're putting enough down to control weeds, but not so much that we're damaging seedlings. If we don't put enough down, we're not going to be effective in controlling the weed growth. If we put too much down, we can either slow the growth down of our seedlings, damage our seedlings, or in some cases even kill them. So if you can't control the rate of application, you probably need to have somebody else do these types of applications for you. This really requires some experience and good, well-calibrated spray equipment to do effectively. There's also post-emergent herbicides, and these are materials that we're putting on to plants that are actively growing, but we're either doing a directed spray that does not contact our seedlings, or our seedlings have some resistance to this particular type of herbicide. So in the case of glyphosate, we're doing directed sprays, or we're spraying seedlings that are dormant and not actively growing. So we're doing early spring or late fall applications to weeds that are actually growing, but seedlings that are dormant. Or we're doing a directed spray, so we're not making contact with the seedling, but we're spraying weeds around it. In the case of transline, we can spray over the top of some seedlings, typically not legumes, things like locust or redbud, but many of our other seedlings will tolerate transline to kill a variety of problematic weeds that will grow during the summer season. So you can see that you need to have some pretty good capacity to understand how to use the herbicides and also how to control rate of application. Rate of application for glyphosate, essentially we're mixing it to a percent, usually 1 or 2% solution, and spraying to cover the materials we want to control, trying to avoid contact to the plants that we want to grow. With transline, we do need to mix it to specific concentrations based on the label and do a spray in the area that we want to control. So it requires some expertise. It requires paying attention to the label and also making sure that you know how much material you're spraying. Some recommendations. So glyphosate is probably one of the safest materials for landowners who don't have a lot of experience with herbicide application to utilize, if you consider how you're applying it. So glyphosate will kill what it contacts in most cases, as long as those plants are green or growing. And so if you can protect your seedlings from the spray and just get the spray on what you want to kill, you can be quite effective. This can be done sometimes by taking something like a waste paper basket and cutting it in half and putting it on a stick and using that as a shield to protect your seedling from the spray. Or if you're spraying around your seedlings before the buds are starting to break or you've got any leaf area on, that can be effective. If you know how to control your rates of application, you can also utilize some pre-emergent herbicides applied in the spring to reduce that weed germination and provide you some longer lasting protection through oftentimes the mid part of the growing season from additional weeds. And so some of the materials we've used in the past are after planting, but before the buds on the planted seedlings start to break in the spring, 1 ounce of oust per acre or 4 quarts of pendulum per acre. As a spray after leaf on, carefully directed applications of glyphosate, because we don't want to get it on our growing plant, or Envoy can be used, clethodim, for grasses. And then I mentioned transline. That's very effective on things like Canada thistle, composites like mare's tail, or legumes like black locust, or if we've got alfalfa or some of those other problematic leguminous plants in our plantings. Always, though, check that label for rates and timing of application and make sure you're on the label in terms of type of application you're doing. Transline is also handy at 1 pint per acre after bud break, in particularly plantings with a lot of oak in them, to control Roundup resistant mare's tail and ragweed. We've got some weeds now that are very resistant to glyphosate, but Transline has shown good effectiveness against those. And it's a good way to kind of save a plantation from being overrun by some of these Roundup resistant weeds. Also got an opportunity to use, if you've got grass problems, a material called Post to control foxtail at about 1.5 pints per acre, also in oak plantings. So several options. And if you've got some experience spraying, you can also consult with your forester about other recommendations they have of materials they've utilized for tree plantings that have been effective. Be sure that you are reading the label and understand it. It's important for not just your safety, but also the environmental safety, and that you're legally applying these materials. If you're not applying to the label, you're actually operating against the law, and you become liable for a misapplication and any damage it may create. So important that you understand those label directions, both in terms of safety and application of that material. And if you're uncertain or not confident about your ability to use these herbicides, that's what the professionals and the contractors are for, to help you with those applications to make sure they're done correctly and, most importantly, done effectively. If you do not want to use herbicides, you can use, in some cases, mulching or tillage as an option for weed control. Or in some cases, if you have just primarily annual weed growth that's not completely overtopping your seedlings, that may actually be tolerable. As we mentioned, sometimes that's utilized as a method to kind of shield those seedlings from deer. If you feel like you really need to mow, we recommend a high mowing, 8 or 10 inches high, and kind of late in the season, particularly after bird nesting, to knock down tops so that your seedlings can get some sunlight, but not a lot of low mowing, because that does have a tendency to encourage the growth of grasses that are really competitive with your trees. So we've already mentioned deer, and it certainly bears mentioning. It may be one of the biggest barriers to successful tree planting that I see for conservation tree plantings now. Used to, I would have said it was poor follow-up maintenance of tree plantings in terms of weed control. But now I think deer have actually overtaken that in terms of one of the biggest causes of failure for many tree plantings. Deer populations can browse our seedlings by taking twigs and foliage. The bucks can damage seedlings and even small trees through antler rubbing. And in fact, with deer populations at pretty high levels across the state, and have been for a few decades now, it's really a threat across most parts of the state. There aren't a lot of places where deer are really not an issue. And this is a particularly big problem for smaller plantings, less than a couple of acres. And if you're close to woodlands, which are good deer habitat, you're going to have significant damage. You may actually find it very difficult to get trees established if you don't take some measures against the deer depredation. So typical damage done by deer, this can happen almost any season, but it's particularly common on many of our oaks and other hardwoods in the spring, when that lush, soft foliage comes out. It's full of nutrients, it's tender, and it's one of the favorite foods of deer. And so red oaks, and to a lesser extent white oaks, and many of our other shrub and tree species are highly favored by the deer for browse, particularly in the early spring, but they'll utilize them all year long. And occasionally I have folks that kind of doubt that deer are a problem for tree establishment. And I always like to show this photo. This was actually just west of Purdue's campus. The planting was put in 2008. And this photo was taken mid-season 2010. And on the left-hand side, we have black cherry, black walnut, red oak, and white oak planted inside a 7.5 foot tall plastic mesh fence that excludes deer. And on the right side are the same species planted at the same time with no fence. And so you can see some of the black cherry is taller than the fence already, this kind of midway through the third growing season, where the trees of almost every species on the right-hand side are essentially not visible. Most of them are less than knee-high. And that is almost completely due to browsing by deer. And those damaging elements can continue through the history of the planting. And so this is an interior shot of that same planting on the left-hand side of the screen 9 years later. We've got good establishment of tree seedlings. We're starting to get some good canopy cover, shading down the competing vegetation, developing that forest environment underneath. On the right side, that's 9 years later. We do have a few seedlings that have snuck their canopies past the deer, but you can see what kind of condition they're in and how thin it is. It can barely be considered a tree planting, much less a successful and effective one. So what do we do about this? Well, actually what we found to be the most effective technique to prevent significant damage to our plantings is fencing of one type or another. And I know a lot of people don't like to hear that because it's an extra expense, but we have found that if you really want to solve the problem, this is really one of the most effective ways to do it. You've got several options, depending on what kind of management you want to do and what you have available to you. What we call the peanut butter fence. This is the peanut butter baited electric fence. And so we use any type of conductor wire. It can be the single wire or woven wire, whatever you want to use. And we bait this fence. It's oftentimes just one wire on fiberglass stakes. We'll bait this fence with either foil or little contact containers that can be electrified with peanut butter. Or you can do scent in some cases with some of the systems, and it'll attract the deer, and they, out of smelling it or curiosity, will nose this and get an electric jolt. And that electric jolt they associate with the visible features of that fence, and they have a tendency to stay away from it. We've actually found this to be quite effective at repelling deer from entering the area, even though the deer could jump right over the top of it. But what they tend to do is test this, get that unpleasant experience, and then shy away from it. The trick with this is it does require pretty consistent maintenance and checking. And so if things fall on it or weeds lay up against it, it can discharge it. If a deer in excitement knocks it down, obviously you've got to get back out there and make sure that fence is still operational, because deer are going to kind of continually check this to see if they can get in that area. So you may need to occasionally rebait it as well to make sure the deer are getting an unpleasant experience associated with making contact with that fence. Another approach, and actually we encourage using this in combination with this approach, is the high visibility electric band fence. And so sometimes out of curiosity, the deer will make contact with this. And once again, this can be a one strand, or some people will make what we call a deep fence, and that's two strands and then one strand about 3 feet outside of those first two strands to give it a little bit of depth. That tends to bother the deer some too in terms of trying to go over it. But I think it's more effective to bait this also as well, so that the deer make contact with it, get that unpleasant experience, and associate the visible aspects of that fence with that unpleasant experience. And they'll have a tendency to stay out of that too. But same maintenance issues, you've got to have a charger. And so oftentimes you're using a solar charger or a battery system, obviously. And so that's got to be maintained, and you got to make sure the fence is still charged and well maintained as well. What we have a tendency to use on our plantings now is physical mesh fencing. And so this is metal mesh fencing in Pennsylvania, and they use metal because they have bears. If you don't have bears, you can typically use plastic fence. But with bears will go right through a plastic fence, and so your fence is destroyed with the first bear that decides it wants in or out of the area. And you can imagine the cost of this. It's very expensive, but they found it's one way they can regenerate some of their forest environments because of their incredibly high deer populations there. We in Indiana, because we occasionally get the bear here, but we don't have them commonly, we can use the plastic mesh fence I showed you earlier, protecting that one planting. And so this is a polypropylene fencing, mesh, usually 2x2 or thereabouts. If you look up plastic mesh deer fence, there's many different vendors, a variety of heights. We like 7.5 to 8 feet. A deer technically can jump over this, but they typically won't. They're looking for easy food value. And so they don't want to go to the work of this. They're more likely to try to crawl underneath it. And so you actually need to kind of stake this fence down. And you'll also notice on the sides there, we've got it flagged. It can be hard to see. And so it's a good idea to add visibility signals on there so deer don't run into it. We actually have a publication that talks about how to build this fence. It's relatively easy to build, and we're actually working on some options where we're utilizing fence posts, metal T-posts and PVC pipe instead of the wood posts. And so our thing there is how to build a plastic mesh deer exclusion fence. That's our publication that gives some details on how to build this, but you can do some modifications if you need to. We do recommend 7.5 to 8 foot tall mesh and to use some stakes on the ground. And it's nice to have it attached to wire in 2 or 3 places running around so that the deer can't just easily run through it. Another option is, as was mentioned earlier, tree tubes. And so these are plastic tubes that are placed around seedlings, and the seedlings will grow inside those. And actually kind of produces a greenhouse type environment that the seedlings in some cases will pop out of the top of these tubes the first or second growing season. There are several different varieties commercially available. They're somewhat expensive, but if you get the 5-foot tubes, they provide pretty good protection from deer browse and can also make it easier to apply weed control. You've essentially got a sheltered seedling already, and so you could do a targeted application of something like glyphosate right around the base of those tubes to control weeds. You'll notice these have got a little mesh stocking on top. That's to prevent birds from flying down into these tubes. We've had some problems with that in the past. And also the other thing to watch out is wasps will like to build nests in those tubes as well. So be careful when you look down your tube that you don't get a face full of wasps in the process. And that mesh would probably help keep those out to some extent too. In terms of the economics of the balance between fencing versus tubes, it depends on the density of your tree plantings, but for kind of a standard conservation planting, once you're up above a ½ acre to an acre, in a lot of cases, the fence, the plastic mesh fence or the electrified fences is economically a little cheaper and easier to put in place than the tubes. If you're in kind of rough territory, not easy to fence, or you've got a smaller planting or patchy planting scattered around, the tubes may be a really good choice. But both of those we found to be very effective at preventing deer damage and very important in high deer density areas for establishing seedlings. The other thing we want to encourage you to think about down the road, depending on your objectives, is follow-up management after weed control and kind of paired with deer protection. So I should mention the fencing, we usually only keep it up anywhere from 6 to 8 years tops. What we're trying to do is get those seedlings tall enough so that the top of the seedling can't be browsed out by deer. Once we're there, we can take that fencing down, and oftentimes it's starting to look photo degrade and get kind of in bad shape anyway, and open that planting up because the deer now aren't able to eat the tops out of our trees, and so we can get vertical height growth on our trees. We may have some antler rub and some browsing on the sides. That's going to happen anyway, and we actually probably want to have wildlife utilizing those plantings at some point. So temporary solutions, but we get good long-term results. Similar situation with the tree tubes. We get the trees growing out of the top of the tubes, but you want to keep those tubes on those trees for usually 2, 3, 4 years after the tree has emerged from the top, because once it gets out the top, it now has to develop some stem strength. And so we don't want to take that tube right off because literally those trees can just flop over. So we're still leaving the tube on there for a while, but after a few years, you can take those tubes off. If they're still decent shape, you could reuse them, but a lot of times they also get brittle standing out there in the sun. So after some time, you may find that it's beneficial to look at doing some thinning in your planting. And nature will thin. The natural competition with trees will sort out winners and losers. But the reason we thin is we thin to maintain good growth and vigor of the desired trees that we want to keep in the planting, and we want to pick the winners and the losers. If we let nature do the thinning, essentially everything is going to slow down quite a bit for a while as that sorting process happens of who's stronger and who's weaker. And the winners may not be who we want to be the winners. So if we've got a set of species that we want to see maintained in that planting, and we want to maintain good, vigorous growth through time, thinning is a really good practice. And so depending on the spacing of our planting, we're usually going to be back in there in 10 to 20 years to start doing some thinning to maintain additional growth space for the trees that we want to see grow. So the question is then, how do we select those trees to favor? And a lot of it has to do with your objectives. And so one of the things I would think about is what trees are going to meet my property objectives the most. And then also think about maintaining the diversity of tree species across that plantings, across the planting, and then also look at trying to develop a good even spacing so I can maintain as many trees per acre that are in a good growing condition. So what we're oftentimes doing is what we call a kind of a crop tree management approach, and we'll show you a slide talking about that in detail. So how do you know when you need to thin? Well, one of the things you can look at are crowns. Actually, let me go to this previous one. I should point out, this is a walnut plantation that practically every tree planted is still there. And so if we plant on an 8x8 spacing, that's 680 trees per acre. Once trees get to be maybe 10 inches in diameter, we should probably have less than 300 trees per acre, perhaps only 150, 200. And so we've got way more trees here than this site can effectively grow. And you can see that the trees are very skinny, very tall, and they've actually got a lot of sprouts on the stem. That's an indication that they're trying to make up for the crown that they don't have anymore of leaf area. So all of these trees are really in pretty poor health. Should have been thinned probably 10 years ago. So we don't want to see our trees get in that kind of condition. This photo is showing the same situation. This is a tree planting that I actually had the privilege of writing the plan for back in the 90s, and I revisited it just a couple of summers ago. And it had a little bit of thinning done in it, but it needs to do some more. And the way I know that is I'm looking at these two tulip trees here right in the center. And you'll see that if you look at the crown canopies on those trees, they've got about half a crown. So if we wanted to draw a nice big lollipop circle where the crown of that tree would be, we can see on each of those trees, about half of it is missing because they're strongly competing with one another. And so ideally, one of those trees should probably go in a thinning to favor the growth of one of the others and give it enough space so that it can continue to be healthy. If we leave these trees in place, because they've got greatly reduced crown size, they're also going to see significantly reduced growth rates through time and gradually become less and less healthy. And in fact, I notice on the right-hand one here, you already see some sprouts popping up on the lower stem. That's in response to not having enough canopy to continually meet the needs of the tree for growth and vigor. So we can help the vigor, health, and growth rates of our forest areas that we've planted by doing that thinning. So one of the neat approaches to thinning is what we call a crop tree crown release. And so our first step is to select what trees we want to continue to grow in the planting. And so we're typically looking for trees of desirable species for our objectives that are already expressing pretty good growth and good healthy crowns. And we're going to select at least 20 to 30 of these well spaced across an acre across our planting site. And you may even want to mark these with paint or flagging. Evenly spaced crop trees at that density should be 35 to 45 feet apart as kind of a guide. And then we're going to thin around those selected crop trees to provide them a 75 to 100% free canopy area for growth. And so what that means is we're going to divide that crown into quadrants. And we want at least 3 of the 4 quadrants free of competition on that side. And so we're going to girdle or drop the competing trees near that tree. And what that does is provide additional growing space for the next few years and allow that canopy to expand and get more sunlight to continue growing. And ultimately, that's going to fill in those growing spaces that we've created. If you feel like you're thinning more than you want, rather than reducing the amount of release you give to each tree, reduce the number of crop trees you select. And so go back to like 15 or 20 crop trees per acre, but do the complete thinning around the outside edge of those crop tree crowns to make sure they're getting all of this sunlight and space they need to retain health. Now, in plantations where we've established nurse crop rows, you can actually do row thinning. And so in a place where you're maybe using white pine as a nurse tree for your hardwoods, like we showed in an earlier slide, you could do a thinning down those rows, just taking the pine out as the first thinning and keeping the row of hardwoods until you maybe need to do a thinning another 10 years or so from now. And that can even be done mechanically by some of these skid steer attachments that essentially chew up or cut off trees right down a row. And that's exactly what we've done at this Purdue planting. So a very quick and easy mechanical approach at thinning a plantation for that first thinning. Pruning is a little bit more of a specialized activity, and I don't recommend it for all plantings. It's really dependent on your objectives and what you hope to accomplish down the road. So pruning can be used for a variety of different objectives. In many cases, we're pruning to produce higher timber quality. And so we're going to remove forks to retain a long, straight log length. And then we're going to remove side limbs to reduce the number of knots that we've got present on that log. And so ultimately, we're going to be growing longer log lengths of more clear lumber. And so this is a practice that's done to produce long-term, high-quality, high-value timber. And therefore, you need to think about what species you're going to do that on. And so for our timber markets, typically our highest quality, highest value trees are things like black walnut, white oak, red oak, black cherry, sugar maple. These tend to be some of our highest value trees that we find on the landscape and probably are some of our best targets for pruning to get good returns. Now, you got to recognize that pruning is something that you're doing on a product that's not going to be harvestable probably for 50 plus years. So you may be pruning for somebody else to get the advantage of that. And if you're good with that, that's great. We don't typically recommend pruning any more than 50 to 100 trees per acre. And if you can get your trees selected as crop trees down below that, just prune your crop trees if you're looking at timber crop trees. No need pruning a bunch of trees that are going to get thinned out of the planting and can't grow to maturity anyway. Pruning could also be done, though, in some cases to provide access, to provide viewscapes, shooting lanes, whatever you need to do. One of the guidelines, though, that we want to follow with pruning is doing proper pruning and also not taking too much of the canopy off. And so a proper approach to pruning is what we typically call target or branch collar retention pruning. And so on this example, we've got an oak tree here, and we're going to show two different approaches at pruning. And the one in the middle is the one that's still mostly recommended based on the physiology of the tree. And that's what we call branch collar or target pruning. And this is where we're actually looking at where the tree branch attaches to the trunk of the tree. We're going to see a change in the diameter and also a little bit of texture. And this zone right here where it gets fatter, and we see a little bit of a texture change, is called the branch collar. And when we do our pruning, we want to stay just outside that branch collar. And we want to be perpendicular with the line of the branch. And the reason we do that is we produce a small injury point, and there's actually specialized cells in this area that produce what's called a callus. It's new wooden material that grows over the top of this injury point to seal it. We do not recommend the application of any kind of wound sealings or paint. If you do a good pruning approach and you've got good, healthy trees that are growing well, it's better just to let them heal naturally. Now, another approach that's been done with pruning in the past, and there's actually been some experiments done on it showing it can be effective, is called flush cut pruning. And you can see this is where we're just cutting down essentially flush with the angle of the trunk of the tree. The disadvantage of this is you produce a much larger injury point. The only real advantage might be is that what we don't have here is this little bump, which would be a knot in the timber. But so far, we think the trade-off between a smaller injury point and the better healing is a better bet for producing high quality wood than the flush cut. So this middle example is the technique we are recommending still at this point for producing timber. Get your branches cut off typically if you want to prune before they're 2 inches in diameter. And we want to maintain at least about 40% of the total height of the tree in live leaf area. And so do not prune up your trees so it looks like a lollipop with just a little bit of foliage at the top. You're taking off too much of the growth engine of the tree, which is the leaf area. So pruning should be done gradually, taking off larger lower limbs as you go. There's a variety of places you can get additional assistance for tree planting, and that may include financial assistance. And so the U.S. Department of Agriculture, through the Natural Resource Conservation Service, the Farm Service Agency, and the Associated Soil and Water Conservation Districts in the counties, have cost-sharing programs that can help landowners with a variety of conservation practices. And so many landowners who own land out in the countryside or even suburban areas, depending on your acreage and ownership and your objectives, may be eligible for some of these conservation practices. And these include conservation tree planting, windbreaks, weed control for plantings, protective fencing now for preventing deer browse is even included in some tree planting cost share programs. Cost sharing for thinning, in some cases for pruning, for invasive species control on properties, and for a lot of different erosion control and wildlife habitat practices. So if you are interested in doing a variety of conservation practices, including tree planting on your property, it may pay you to pay a visit to the Natural Resource Conservation Service office in your county. You can also find those offices at this website down here, or simply do a web search on USDA Service Center Indiana, and you'll get a listing there of the NRCS FSA offices in your county. And you can check with those folks to see if you're eligible, see what practices might match your property objectives, and see what you might be interested in participating in. It's important to recognize, though, that when you get involved with these cost share programs, you're entering into a contract with the government. And so they have expectations from you for giving you the money to help you with those practices. So you need to be sure you're comfortable with the expectations and the requirements for the program match your property objective managements. And the district and consulting foresters are very commonly working with these programs. They're familiar with them as well, so they can help guide you in terms of what programs might also be beneficial for you. The other thing is the application approach can take some time. I've used these programs on my own property. It was about a year between my application and actually getting approved to start working. So there can be some time delays in that, but the cost sharing to help you with these conservation practices may be worth it in terms of helping you offset the costs of these practices. And I've had good luck with these programs myself. So the old saying is the best time to plant trees was 20 years ago, and the second best time is today. And I think that is true. But I've had the pleasure during my career of working at Vilonia State Tree Nursery, producing seedlings, and then working as a district forester for about 15 years, doing tree planting plans and inspecting tree plantings. And now working as an extension forester, and I've actually revisited some of the tree plantings I planned as a young district forester over 25 years ago now, some of them a little older than that even. This is one of those, and it's really just incredibly heartening to see how quickly and how well our trees can grow here in Indiana if they're properly planted and well cared for. Our ground wants to grow high quality trees. And so if you want to do something for yourself and also for the next generation, tree planting is a wonderful practice to put on your property. So we have a lot of resources available through Purdue Forestry and Natural Resources Extension. This is our website that you can access us there. And I really appreciate your folks' attendance at this program. I'm going to leave this screen up just for a little bit so you can get contact information from me if you need it. I'm happy to answer questions as they may come up. And I'd also really appreciate it if you could use your cell phone or tablet to either use your camera app, or if you've got a QR code reader, this QR code will take you to a survey for this program. And if you'd be willing to do that and give us feedback on that program, I would really appreciate it. It helps us know how effectively we're meeting the needs of the people that attend our programs. So your feedback is valued for that. I'll leave this up just for a little bit. And then we'll get ready to, I'll stop screen sharing and we'll start tackling some of the questions that I'm sure you've got here to conclude the program. So I'll leave that up for 2 or 3 more seconds here, and then I'll stop my screen sharing and we'll get started on the questions.